I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am participating in this event from the traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, and in particular the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. For those attending this session, I also want to acknowledge the Indigenous territories and lands on which you are living and working. Data is everywhere. We collect it, we interpret it, and we apply it to almost every part of our lives, whether we know it or not. Our brains naturally sort data and find meaningful patterns, but now we're simulating that process in machines to make our lives a little easier, but also help us to solve big problems. I'm Jill Schnarr, and I am the Chief Communications Officer at Telus. I'm also your host for the Future Builders series. At Telus, we are passionate about the intersection of social purpose and world-leading technology to drive change and enable remarkable human outcomes. And this is what this series with Elevate is all about. We are all making the future friendly together. To put it simply, artificial intelligence, or AI, connects the best of technology's efficiency and scale with human learning and problem-solving capabilities. Every business can leverage this data better. And from my perspective, leading Telus's corporate communications team, I see the potential in AI to help us predict potential issues, analyze our own or our competitors' strategies, and so on. What's particularly exciting is using this technology to automate routines in order to open up time for innovation. A lot of people are skeptical of AI, but the reality is artificial intelligence has the power to enhance and improve technology as long as we build solutions mindfully and with transparency to get the most beneficial outcomes. To tell us how we do that, we have Pam Snively, our Chief Data and Trust Officer, who has significantly transformed Telus's approach to transparency in its data handling practices over the past 5 years, enabling us to be recognized as world leaders in privacy. Her approach has put us on a path ensuring our team and our customers have the tools and data needed to empower them and make better decisions. Pam is my go-to expert on privacy and data ethics, and she actively encourages other organizations to join her in her mission to earn and elevate consumer trust in our digital ecosystem and what is more important these days. So I'd like to welcome Pam, but Pam, before we start getting into the fundamentals, here is our first question. When was the first time you realized the power of data?
The first time. Well, thanks, Jill, for that question. If I were thinking back, it would be when I was actually pretty young. I'm sure there were other times before that, but when I was in grade 7 and 8, I started a cookie company with a friend of mine. And we started off just doing the kind of traditional after-school thing. We bake cookies and offer them to people, and then we started realizing we could turn this into a bit of a business. We had a lot of mothers on the street who wanted to entertain and maybe didn't want to have to bake their own cookies. So we started baking, and we were using initially our own parents' ingredients, and we sold them for what we thought we could sell them for, and we rounded it nicely to, I'm going to date myself here, but to $1 a dozen, and took them to our neighbors. Word of mouth got around, and we were, pretty busy. It was great. Our only constraint was really how much time we had in the day after school, and we continued to use our mother's supplies, and sometimes we go and buy our own, but we weren't thinking too much about the data. It didn't occur to us to think about how much time does it take us to make per dozen cookies, and what really should we be charging? So we I could say I've rarely worked that hard in my entire life over the course of the next month fulfilling orders, because it was coming up to holiday season, and yet we ended up in the hole owing our parents money for the cookies. So we realized very quickly we needed data, in terms of how much we should be charging, how many orders we could take. So that was a lesson well learned at a young age, and any other future entrepreneurial endeavors were going to look a lot different for me. That was for sure.
All right, great story. Well, let's start our conversation with the fundamentals of artificial intelligence and how it's useful from a consumer perspective, because I think when people think of AI, they think of, maybe machines taking over the world, and I think we see a lot more positive upside associated with it. So, can you tell us about the opportunities associated with AI?
Wow, Jill, I'd almost say the easier question to answer would be what areas of our lives could not be improved with AI. For us to use AI, even just for basic data-driven decision making, even just what I just described, would be phenomenal. Um, there is such incredible power in data, and it can be used for everything from the paradigm of do we get great recommendations from TV providers about what movies or TV shows we might like next. But on a much grander scale, we can actually see how data and AI, augmented intelligence, could transform our society in a much more meaningful way. And we're talking about really changing the world. And I know this is very core to Telus mission, as you talked about, and to some of our key pillars, health, the environment, community, bridging digital divides. And if we just think about health for a second, the amount of information and the better decision making we could make if we were able to mine just the existing data. We don't need to collect more data even. Just the existing data right now could tell us how we could be far more efficient in the allocation of resources in our healthcare system. It could tell us which regimens, which drugs, which care models are most effective. We can cure diseases. My team often teases me of being a little too passionate about what we could do to change the world, and I sometimes talk about if we don't get busy fast, their babies are dying that we could be saving, and I really feel that way. But that's the promise. There is also considerable peril to what we're seeing in front of us, and you alluded to this at the beginning of your talk, where we know that there are concerns around augmented intelligence and data analytics, and that a lot can go wrong. So we need to behave responsibly. We are at a bit of a tipping point, I think, in society where we can either get this right and we can leverage the data and have all these amazing outcomes where we can really change life for the better, or we will get it wrong. We'll have too many negative incidents, too many times where trust is broken. And one of two things will happen. We'll be regulated out of existence until we can't innovate anymore. Or we will simply lose consumer citizen trust in the data environment and the data ecosystem. And if that happens, we won't have that data to be able to power AI and come up with these solutions. So we need to get busy really fast because we can't afford to make very many more mistakes.
So we know that AI is fueled by data, but what are the questions we should be asking? What should we be thinking about to ensure the benefits of AI are realized?
So great question, and I think there are two parts to the answer. So there's what can we be thinking about as consumers and citizens, and I can talk about that a little bit more later, where we talk about what should we be looking for in an organization? How do we know which organizations we can trust and which we can't? But I think also what we really need to be paying attention to is us as an organization or organizations and government. What are we thinking about how we are handling this data? And I think it's a really interesting analogy to say that data is the fuel for AI. But I also think it is helpful to think of it as the teacher for AI, because our AI and machine learning models learn from data. And when we think of it that way, we think, well, what do we want from our teachers? We want quality teachers. We want to invest in really great quality teachers because we know we won't get the outcomes we want in education otherwise. Same thing, we need to invest in quality data. We need to be paying a lot of attention to the quality of the data that is going to be teaching these AI machine learning systems. Similarly, we would not tolerate biased teachers. So we should not tolerate biased data. And we need to be paying a lot of attention to where the data set's coming from and whether or not it is perpetuating biases, because it will learn what we teach it. And what we have been doing in the past will inform the future unless we pay attention in how we design our algorithms and how we clean our data. We run the risk of perpetuating and actually exaggerating and aggravating biases from the past. So really important to think about those aspects. In my field, privacy and consent used to be the only things we really had to think about. Has someone consented to that use? Is there a violation of privacy law? But it has gotten much broader now. We have to be thinking about whether or not a particular use is ethical. And the whole field of data ethics has exploded, and that takes us into really uncharted territory about customer and citizen expectations, and how we develop principles and ethical regimes and frameworks to make these types of decisions. So these are the things that we need to be focused on, as I say, unless we want to make more mistakes that will endanger customer trust.
Let's talk a little bit about that. I think people would be, better with sharing their data if it was anonymized. And can you talk about how we can get access to data that actually helps us, address issues or solve problems, but it's anonymized so that we protect, customers' privacy and consent as well?
Yeah, so this is an area that's really near and dear to my heart, because I think that there are two things about this. We can use anonymized or what we often call de-identified data to power AI and to power analytics that can be really transformative. And we can also use AI to create de-identified or synthetic data. So there's some really great work that's going on out there right now to use AI to create what is essentially fake data sets, but they carry all the characteristics of the real data set, insofar as we will get accurate outcomes, but they don't actually imperil anyone's privacy. De-identified data is the same idea. So we can actually take out identifiers from the data sets, and even identifier proxies or quasi-identifiers, we call them. So the data set can't be tracked back to an individual, but we can still look at the really large trends and patterns and see the big picture, which is what we really want when we're talking about solving big problems. We don't need to know, where Jill is or where Pam is or what Pam's doing, what Jill's doing. We need to understand what is really happening in our society as a whole, in our communities, and in different demographics, so that we can make better decisions about everything. So we've been doing a lot of work on de-identification, and we're really proud of our Data for Good program, which leverages de-identified data, and has been used to help in the battle against COVID.
We actually asked our viewers to submit questions on responsible AI and what they might be wondering in regards to how it might impact their daily lives. So let's take a look at a few of those questions, because you touched on it there. What is Telus doing to ensure that AI is used responsibly?
So really proud of the work that we've been doing in that space. And I've been working with a lot of external parties as well as other organizations, trying to figure out what do best practices look like, and get on the leading edge of that, so that we can get ahead of this trust conundrum and make sure that we are doing the right thing. So one of the key things that we've done is layer some really new and really rigorous new review processes into our project initiation process. So when we're looking at whether or not we should do something with data or a project, we're going to be looking at it on a much broader scale from the get-go. We're going to be looking at it from an ethical perspective. We're going to look at data quality. What's the provenance of the data? What was it given to us for? What was it? What were the expectations of the individuals who entrusted us with that data? Is what we're planning consistent with that? And is even if they wouldn't know necessarily exactly what the expectation, we can't know exactly what expectations are. We can start to look at how can we answer some of those questions about what people would be all right with. So focus groups didn't used to be a part of a privacy program, but now when we're getting into more these harder questions around should we be doing these things, not just can we be doing these things, we have to get a lot more information about what our customers and citizens feel about certain data uses, and look at what we call sort of social license to do certain things with data.
Okay, great. The next question is in regards to data regulation. So as we know, the telecom industry is a highly regulated industry because of costs and infrastructure and so on and so forth. The question now is, do we need new data regulations in Canada regarding AI? I actually just read today that 1.1 billion in federal funding from the Canadian government for AI has, been poured into a handful of startups and some, big tech firms and universities. And so much is being poured into this industry, but we don't necessarily have a clear regulatory framework. Are there new data regulations associated with this?
So that's a great question. Our existing legislation is principle based. So I would maintain that if an organization is paying close attention to those principles and is really observing those principles in a meaningful way, then I think they would be doing the right thing. And that's certainly the approach that we've taken at Telus, which is if we are trying to be consistent with customer expectations and trying to do only things that a customer would expect and would see as appropriate in the circumstances. That's actually the wording in our legislation. That's a very broad obligation on us. And if we're taking it seriously, we'd be doing the right thing. But that said, I think there is some need for our citizens and consumers to have a little bit more confidence in the legislation. I think there are a lot of questions, a lot of people asking the question you just asked, which is, is our legislation too old? Is it up to date? Again, because it's principled, I think it still holds up. But that said, if it doesn't give consumers confidence, it's not good enough. And so I think we're seeing new legislation that's in draft legislation out right now, proposed, that talks more about how can we monitor automated decision making. How can we make sure that there is a human who's ultimately accountable for decisions that are made through augmented intelligence? And that goes a long way to giving people the comfort and security that they want, that they would be able to go to a human with a decision they think is not fair. So I think we need to think hard about how do we build that rule in a way that is not going to create too much burden and overhead for organizations for every single little thing that is done through AI, but will certainly be available to consumers where something is going to have a significant impact on them. So a decision that matters to them, it should be reviewable. A decision that is pretty insignificant, that's just creating administrative burden, and that's not what we need here in Canada.
Right. Okay, so we're talking about AI in the real world. And to help our viewers envision what that means, let's move to the Future Builders Challenge. So in each episode, we'll provide our guest with a real world scenario about what we're talking about, and then challenge them to share an example. And in this case, how AI can positively impact our lives. So here's the challenge for you, Pam. You're the new mayor of a fast-growing, big urban city. You were elected on a mandate to introduce smart cities, technology, and infrastructure. What is the first program that you would introduce and why?
I'm sure I was supposed to answer with, the program that's going to change lives. But I think, maybe it's my own bias where I come from. The first program I think I would want to introduce would be a program about how to introduce programs. It would be about how do we get buy-in from citizens on the sharing of data, the decision-making around it, the governance process, and how much transparency there should be in the decision-making we're doing about what we'll do with data. So if we're going to be building from the ground up in a smart city environment, I think that's kind of table stakes. That's where we need to start. There needs to be a model that everyone is comfortable with about how decisions will be made, how we will govern ourselves and our data. And so if we start with a really small project that nobody could argue with, something, for social benefit, we could build that muscle a little bit where people get used to trusting the system because they can see what's happening. So they have a voice in, as I say, how much transparency there would be. It could be very basic tech, but it would be about elevating that fairness and transparency component of the program.
Okay, so we've just finished talking about the basics of AI. Now let's dive into the application and how we can uphold a standard of responsibility in its implementation, which is everything that you stand for, Pam. So we're talking about responsible AI. What does responsible actually really mean here?
Responsible AI is about, I think, the rigor with which we make decisions and the amount of transparency and fairness involved in that decision making. And it's not about ethics washing. It's not about just putting principles up on your website and saying, here are our principles, and then not thinking about it again. It's not policy driven. It's practice driven. It's about demonstrating transparency about the types of things you're doing with data and how you're doing them. We talked earlier about de-identification and anonymization. It's something people hear a lot about, but they don't necessarily understand what it is. So it's not terribly comforting to the average consumer if they don't know what it means. So it's about explaining that in ways that garner trust. But ultimately, it's about using the data in ways that we are sure that our customers and consumers and citizens would be comfortable with if they were to take the time to inquire into all the details. And it's about allowing them to understand it if they do want to take that time to inquire into all the details and having that information available to them.
Well, yeah, I mean, that information should be available to consumers, customers. We should know the policies that every individual organization or company stands for in regards to responsible AI. So, what are the traits of responsible AI in an organization that you'd look for, like their privacy policies or their values? Can you talk to that?
Yeah, so I'm glad you gave those two examples, Jill, because I think the privacy policy is important to those of us who are in the privacy industry, but it's, let's be honest, not that important to the average individual, and most people are not reading privacy policies. So when I go out and I talk to people about making sure that they're engaging with an organization that they trust, I would advocate, not for spending too much time reading the privacy policy. That's not the best way to distinguish. And in so many cases, so many companies have the identical privacy policy. It's looking at whether you can see that they are actually living their values, whether they're speaking about them, because every organization has great values and they put them on their website somewhere. It's, are you seeing them in action? How often are you hearing about them when their speakers and executives and leaders and doers go out and talk about the organization? Can you hear that those values are infusing their activities and the way that they're describing things? And I think that's really important. If I were to invite someone to our website, we have a privacy center. I think the last thing I would tell them that they need to do is read the privacy commitment, which is still, I think, hopefully a little more interesting than the average privacy policy. But there's a lot of other information on there that is about, what is de-identification and what types of data analytics do we do and what types of data do we collect and what types of data do we not collect. Lots of FAQs. So a lot of effort from certain organizations goes into communicating really clearly and effectively with individuals about what they stand for. And I think when you can see other values infusing all their actions, you know that there's a mechanism within that organization to try to make decisions and do the right thing. So I think that's a really important piece. If I were going to get a little bit more practical for a second, I would say a really great question to ask of an organization when you're talking about AI and machine learning in particular is, how do you make sure that what you have trained your algorithms to do is what they are doing 6 months from now? And that's a really significant change because we are talking about machine learning. The machines learn and they learn from the data. And so if we train it to do something and we assess whether it's doing exactly what we wanted it to do, and we've made all the right decisions about that's the appropriate thing for it to do, and then we leave it and we don't pay attention to it and we don't monitor it, 6 months from now, a year from now, it may have learned things we never intended it to learn from the data, and it might be doing things we wouldn't want it to do. And we've all kind of heard some horror stories about machine learning that sort of learns to start telling an organization not to look at the female applicants because there are fewer female executives, so therefore they're less likely to become executives. And terrible stories like that about reinforcing bias. I mean, that's just one example. But we need to have really different review mechanisms and have a level of rigor and diligence in how we govern these systems that hasn't existed up until recently. That wasn't required of organizations, and so they need to be focused on that. And if they're not thinking about it, focused on it, talking about it, it's probably not getting done. And I worry about organizations like that.
Okay, and one last question for you, Pam. You talked earlier about Telus's Data for Good program. Can you actually talk to us about what this means and how it relates back to AI?
Yeah, I would love to. As I said, I'm really excited about this program. So this is a program that leverages our Insights platform, and the Insights platform leverages de-identified location data. So I talked earlier about what de-identified means. So what we've been able to do is take location data that we have to collect in order to allow our mobility services to work. So this isn't new data that we're collecting. And we de-identify it because, again, we're looking for patterns, big patterns. We don't need to know where anybody is. So we de-identify that data, and then we can see some really interesting patterns about how people are moving about. And really early on, after the COVID pandemic hit, we realized very quickly that this could be really useful data about for example, what public policies were working and what were not. What types of rules or urgings from politicians were effective in getting people to stay home, because what we could see, big picture, is how many people were staying put rather than moving about. And it was really dramatic to look at these, sort of these heat maps of activity before and after the stay-at-home orders or the stay-at-home recommendations. But we could get a lot more granular, where we look at, for example, right the day after a particular mayor asks people to please stay home and pleads with them from a moral perspective, versus what might happen in another city where there's actually a legal lockdown. Was there a difference? Was there not a difference? Did we actually see the spread during long weekends where people might go to their cottages? Did we not? So really gives us real-time data, very effective. So what we did is we said we would share this data for free with governments, public health authorities, and researchers who are doing any kind of research on how to fight COVID and flatten the curve or assist in economic recovery. So the data, we can either do reports on it and just report on those trends and patterns, almost like a consulting report, or we can invite data scientists onto our platform in a supervised, guided manner, help them leverage our data so that they can get the most use out of it and support their own research. So we had a tremendous response to that, and we've been getting great feedback about how incredibly helpful it's been on the development of public policy, short-term and long-term. One of the really interesting things I saw was, what happened. I live in Ontario. What happened when we had the lockdown in Toronto, but not in some of the regions just outside of Toronto, just before the holidays. And what we could see was phones that are generally sitting in the Toronto area suddenly moved outside of the Toronto area, and we could see congregating in malls and large, the large urban centers in the areas that did not have lockdown. So that tells us something. That tells us whether or not that's an effective mechanism for the next time, and allows us to make those data-driven decisions that we know will be better for society and help us fight this.
Yeah, that's a fascinating use of the data, and it goes to ensure the importance of de-identifying it. Because then you're okay with supplying that data. It's not like you have a big brother watching you, but you're actually supplying that data so that it can be used to help our society going forward. All right, well, thanks so much, Pam. Really learned a lot today. This was a great discussion. We hear a lot about AI and its potential uses, but there's so much more to it than the headlines, and there's so much amazing inherent good in it, as long as it's done and used responsibly and appropriately. So thank you, Pam, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. To learn more about artificial intelligence, please start with a visit to telus.com/privacy, and catch our next episode on Agriculture, Food for Thought on April 7th. To register, visit elevate.ca, and if you have a moment, please complete our feedback survey. Thank you so much for joining us today.